Welcome back to the channel. Today, we dive into one of the most overlooked aspects of the Second World War, the forgotten heroes. While history books often highlight generals, political leaders, and famous battles, there were countless men and women whose names never made it into the headlines. They were nurses, resistance fighters, code breakers, engineers, laborers, and soldiers from colonies and occupied nations. Their sacrifices, courage, and resilience shaped the war just as much as the better-known figures. This is the story of the unsung forces of WWII, the forgotten heroes. When most people think of World War II, they imagine the major powers, the United States, Britain, Germany, the Soviet Union, and Japan. But this was not just their war. It was a global conflict, one that reached into the farthest corners of the earth, drawing millions of people into the struggle, many of whom remain invisible in the pages of history. Take India, for example. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers volunteered to fight under the British flag, forming the largest volunteer army the world had ever seen. They served in North Africa, Italy, and Burma. They endured scorching deserts, freezing mountains, and dense jungles. Many never returned home. For decades, their courage was overshadowed, forgotten, outside their own families. Across Africa, men from Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa were called upon. They joined the King's African Rifles, a unit that faced brutal combat in the jungles of Burma against Japanese forces. Far from their homeland, they fought in a war that wasn't theirs, yet they carried themselves with dignity, loyalty, and sacrifice. Their stories rarely made headlines, yet their service was vital. Caribbean volunteers also answered the call. Thousands of young men from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and other islands crossed the ocean to fight for Britain. Many became aircrew in the Royal Air Force, braving German fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Others served in the Merchant Navy, facing the constant threat of German U-boats in the Atlantic. For small island nations with limited resources, their contribution was extraordinary. China, too, suffered immensely. Long before Pearl Harbor, Chinese soldiers and civilians resisted Japanese occupation with little support from the outside world. Millions of Chinese lives were lost in a struggle that consumed cities, villages, and entire regions. Their resistance tied down huge numbers of Japanese troops, buying time for the Allies elsewhere. Even the Pacific Islands, remote and often overlooked, played a part. Local people acted as scouts, guides, and stretcher-bearers for Allied forces fighting in the jungle. Their knowledge of the terrain saved countless lives, yet history rarely mentions them. This was the true scale of World War II, not just a clash of great powers, but a collective struggle fought by ordinary men and women from every corner of the globe. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen from colonies and occupied nations stood shoulder to shoulder with those from the major powers. They were promised recognition, equality, and sometimes independence in exchange for their sacrifices. But when the guns finally fell silent, many of those promises were broken. The world remembers Normandy, Stalingrad, and Pearl Harbor, but it too often forgets the deserts of Africa, the jungles of Burma, and the skies above the Caribbean, where countless men and women gave everything for a freedom they were not always granted. Their courage, their endurance, and their sacrifice remind us World War II was not only the story of nations, but of people, millions of forgotten heroes, fighting a war that belonged to all of humanity.
When the world went to war, women stepped forward in ways that transformed societies forever. For centuries, they had been told their place was in the home, far from the battlefield. But as millions of men marched off to fight, women filled the gaps, proving their strength, resilience, and courage in every corner of the conflict. Some served close to the front lines. Nurses and ambulance drivers braved artillery fire and bombing raids to reach the wounded. They worked in blood-soaked field hospitals, often with little sleep, saving lives with steady hands and unshakable will. Many did not survive the war themselves, killed not by a rifle, but by the same shells and bombs that tore through the soldiers they tried to save. In the Soviet Union, women were not just supporters, they were fighters. One of the most legendary was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, known as Lady Death. As a sniper, she recorded over 300 confirmed kills, striking fear into the hearts of the enemy. She became a symbol of determination, proving that courage knows no gender. Then there were the Night Witches, female pilots of the Soviet Air Force. Flying outdated biplanes made of wood and canvas, they carried out bombing raids against German positions. At night, they would cut their engines and glide silently before releasing their bombs, earning their chilling nickname from terrified German soldiers. These women flew thousands of missions, often returning with their planes riddled with bullet holes, yet they never backed down. In Britain, women were equally essential. The Women's Land Army worked the farms, ensuring food reached both civilians and troops. Without them, the nation would have starved. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force played a critical role in operating radar, tracking incoming German aircraft, and manning anti-aircraft defenses. With every blip on a screen and every command sent over the radio, they became an invisible shield protecting their homeland. Meanwhile, across occupied Europe, countless women joined resistance movements. They smuggled weapons beneath baskets of bread. They carried secret messages hidden in children's toys. They guided downed Allied pilots through forests and across borders, often at the risk of execution. Many were captured, tortured, or killed, but they fought on because freedom demanded it. In France, figures like Lucy Arbrack organized daring escapes and sabotage missions. In Poland, women risked everything to move intelligence and supplies through Nazi-occupied streets. Their work was vital to the survival of underground networks. Without them, resistance would have collapsed. Beyond Europe, women contributed in every theater of war. In the United States, millions joined the workforce, building aircraft, tanks, and ships. Known by the symbol of Rosie the Riveter, they proved that industry could thrive with women at the helm. In China and Southeast Asia, women took part in guerrilla warfare against Japanese occupiers, carrying weapons and intelligence through dangerous jungles. Yet for all their service, recognition was often slow to come. Many returned home to find themselves pushed back into traditional roles, their wartime contributions dismissed or forgotten. But history tells another story. The courage of these women, fighters, workers, nurses, and resistors, was every bit as vital as the soldiers on the front lines. They fought not only against tyranny abroad, but against the limitations society placed upon them. World War II may have ended in 1945, but the legacy of women at war continued. Their determination cracked open the door to equality, proving once and for all that when the world is in crisis, women do not stand on the sidelines, they stand at the very heart of the fight. They were the mothers, sisters, and daughters who became soldiers, builders, and heroes. And though history sometimes overlooked them, their courage echoes through time, a reminder that victory in World War II was not won by men alone, but by humanity, united in its darkest hour.
In every occupied land during World War II, there were people who refused to bow, who chose defiance over silence. These were the resistance fighters, ordinary men and women who risked everything to stand against the Axis powers. They fought not with vast armies, but with courage, ingenuity, and the will to be free. In France, the Maquis carried the weight of resistance on their shoulders. Hidden in the countryside and forests, these guerrilla fighters disrupted German operations with sabotage and ambushes. They blew up train tracks to derail supply lines, destroyed communication cables, and spread fear among occupiers. Their bravery came at a heavy cost. If captured, they faced torture or execution. Yet their actions weakened the German grip and laid the foundation for liberation. In Poland, the resistance was even more extraordinary. The Armii Krajowa, or Home Army, was one of the largest underground movements in Europe. Its members smuggled weapons, collected intelligence, and launched daring attacks. In 1944, they rose up against the Nazis in the Warsaw Uprising, holding the city for 63 days under overwhelming odds. Though the uprising was brutally crushed, their defiance became a symbol of national pride and unyielding spirit. Further south, in Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans carried out one of the most successful resistance campaigns of the war. Operating in mountains and forests, they waged relentless guerrilla warfare, tying down hundreds of thousands of German troops who could have been used elsewhere. Despite immense suffering and reprisals against civilians, their persistence eventually helped liberate their own country. In Greece, resistance groups like ELAS struck at occupying forces, often blending into rugged landscapes. Villages became strongholds of defiance, where farmers turned into fighters by night. In Norway, saboteurs carried out daring missions, including the famous raid on the heavy water plant at Vemork, which crippled Germany's nuclear ambitions. Resistance was not limited to Europe. In the Philippines, after Japan's invasion, guerrilla fighters, often civilians armed with little more than hunting rifles and homemade weapons, harassed Japanese patrols and gathered intelligence for the Allies. In Burma, local fighters worked with Allied forces, using their knowledge of dense jungles to strike at Japanese troops. These men and women lived in constant danger. They trusted no one completely, for betrayal could come at any moment. Many resistance fighters were executed in public squares, their sacrifices meant to instill fear. But instead, their deaths often fueled greater determination. What made resistance remarkable was not just the sabotage, the battles, or the daring escapes, it was the spirit behind it. Teachers, students, shopkeepers, and farmers became soldiers of freedom. Entire families risked their lives to hide fugitives, transmit intelligence, or print underground newspapers. Their courage was not born from orders, but from conviction. Though some movements were crushed and many lives were lost, resistance across occupied lands proved one thing. Even in the darkest moments of history, the human spirit refuses to be conquered. The legacy of these resistance fighters reminds us that freedom is never simply given, it is fought for, often by those who seemed the least prepared for war, but the most determined to win it.
When we think of war, we often picture soldiers charging across battlefields or planes soaring through the skies. Yet behind every gun fired, every tank rolled out, and every ship that sailed, there were millions of hands at work. The forgotten laborers whose sweat and sacrifice kept the war machine moving. In China, where Japanese forces occupied vast territories, civilians were forced to build roads, railways, and airfields for the Allied effort.
Entire villages were uprooted, families separated, and lives risked daily in grueling labor under the harshest of conditions. Though their names are lost to history, their work carved out the very pathways on which victory was built. Across Africa, countless men were taken from their farms and villages to support the Allied cause. They carried supplies across deserts, constructed military camps, and kept supply lines open in places where conventional transport was impossible. The East African campaign relied heavily on porters and laborers who endured searing heat, scarce food, and disease, yet pressed on with courage. The Caribbean, too, played a vital part. Workers from Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados traveled to Britain to fill factories and work the docks. They built aircraft, assembled ammunition, and kept the flow of essential supplies moving, all while enduring racism and discrimination in a country that needed them, but rarely welcomed them. Their story is one of sacrifice without recognition. In the Soviet Union, the scale of labor was staggering. As the German invasion advanced, entire industries were dismantled and moved east of the Ural Mountains. Families, including women and children, worked in freezing temperatures in makeshift factories. They produced tanks, planes, rifles, and shells at an unimaginable pace. Every bolt tightened, every weapon finished, represented the determination of a nation under siege. Even the sea lanes were kept alive by the tireless work of laborers. In the merchant navy, crews braved the Atlantic's icy waters, constantly threatened by German U-boats. Many of these men were not professional soldiers, but civilian sailors, working long hours under constant fear of attack. Many never made it home, lost in the cold depths without ceremony or recognition. And then there were the millions of forced laborers, prisoners of war, political captives, and civilians rounded up from occupied lands. Under brutal conditions, they built fortifications like the Atlantic Wall, dug trenches, and worked in munitions factories for the Axis war machine. Many perished from hunger, exhaustion, or cruelty, their suffering buried under the rubble of history. What united all these stories was sacrifice without glory. These men and women rarely wore uniforms. They carried no weapons. They fought with their hands, their endurance, and their determination to survive. Yet without them, the tanks could not roll, the planes could not fly, and the soldiers could not march. The forgotten laborers of World War II remind us that victory is not only forged on the battlefield. It is built in the fields, the factories, the docks, and the workshops by ordinary people who gave their strength so that others could fight. Their legacy is hidden in steel, stone, and sweat, a silent monument to resilience, carved not in marble, but in toil and sacrifice. In the chaos of battle, where bullets tore through the air and shells shook the earth, there were men and women whose mission was not to take life, but to save it. They were the medics and chaplains, figures often overlooked, yet indispensable in the struggle to preserve humanity amidst the brutality of war. Medics entered the battlefield unarmed, carrying nothing more than a red cross stitched to their uniforms and a medical bag slung over their shoulder. Their courage was extraordinary. While others advanced with rifles, medics ran into the line of fire to pole the wounded to safety. They bandaged gaping wounds under relentless gunfire, stopped bleeding with bare hands, and whispered words of comfort to soldiers clinging to life. For many, their bravery cost them their own lives. Enemy fire did not always respect the cross on their helmets. Yet still they went forward, time and again, because to them every life mattered. Their reward was not medals or promotions, but the knowledge that one more soldier would see home again because they chose to risk everything. Alongside them were the chaplains, men of faith, who carried no weapon but offered a different kind of strength. On the front lines, in foxholes and field hospitals, they gave soldiers hope when the darkness seemed overwhelming. They prayed with the dying, comforted the wounded, and buried the dead with dignity. Some chaplains went far beyond their spiritual duties. They carried stretchers, dug graves, and even shielded soldiers with their own bodies. Their presence reminded the men that they were not alone, that even in war, humanity, compassion, and faith endured. One of the most moving examples was the story of the 4 chaplains aboard the U.S. Army transport ship Dorchester in 1943. When the ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat, these 4 men, a priest, a rabbi, and 2 ministers, gave up their life jackets to save others. As the ship sank into the icy Atlantic, survivors remembered seeing the chaplains linked in arm, praying together as the waters closed around them. Their sacrifice became a symbol of faith and unity that transcended division. Medics and chaplains rarely feature in war memorials, yet their courage was of a different kind. They reminded the world that even amid destruction, there was compassion. Even amid hatred, there was love. Even amid death, there was the stubborn insistence on life. Their legacy is quiet but profound. They did not fight for victory in the traditional sense, but for something deeper: the preservation of human dignity in a world torn apart. And for that, they stand among the true, though often forgotten heroes of World War II. Not all heroes of World War II carried rifles or flew aircraft. Some were trapped behind barbed wire, locked in prison camps, or forced to endure the unendurable under occupation. Yet even in captivity and despair, there were acts of quiet defiance, resilience, and courage that deserved to be remembered. These were the prisoners and survivors, men, women, and children who fought in their own way to keep humanity alive. For soldiers taken prisoner, captivity was its own battlefield. In camps across Europe and Asia, they endured hunger, disease, and brutality, but many resisted in silence. Some organized daring escapes, like the legendary event later known as the Great Escape. In 1944, Allied prisoners tunneled out of Stalag Luft III, a German camp, in one of the most ambitious breakouts of the war. Though many were recaptured and executed, their courage embodied the unbroken spirit of defiance. Others resisted in quieter ways. In prison huts, men secretly taught each other languages, mathematics, or history, turning captivity into classrooms. Some created theater productions with costumes stitched from scraps, or composed music with makeshift instruments. These small acts of creativity, though seemingly ordinary, were in truth extraordinary. They kept hope alive where despair was meant to reign. In Japanese prisoner of war camps, conditions were especially brutal. Thousands of Allied soldiers were forced into labor on the infamous Burma Railway, enduring starvation, disease, and merciless treatment. Yet even here, prisoners found ways to support each other, sharing food, tending to the sick, and maintaining bonds of solidarity that became lifelines in the darkest moments. But it was not only soldiers who suffered. Civilians in occupied lands bore unimaginable burdens. Families lived under constant fear of arrest,
deportation, or execution. Yet countless ordinary people chose to resist in quiet, powerful ways. In Poland, Irena Sendler smuggled more than 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, giving them false identities and placing them with Christian families. She risked everything, and though captured and tortured by the Gestapo, she never revealed the names of the children she had saved. Her story is just one, among thousands of unsung acts of defiance and compassion. In the Netherlands, families hid Jews in basements, attics, and even behind false walls. The story of Anne Frank became one of the most famous accounts of survival, but it represents countless others who lived in silence and fear, depending on the bravery of those who sheltered them. In villages across Europe, farmers shared their last scraps of bread with fugitives. Priests forged baptismal certificates to protect children. Neighbors chose silence when questioned by occupying forces, knowing the truth but refusing to betray their own people. These were not soldiers, they were survivors, heroes in the simplest but most profound sense. Survival itself became an act of resistance. To hold on to life, to keep one's humanity intact under tyranny, was a form of defiance no enemy could fully extinguish. The prisoners and survivors of World War II remind us that courage takes many forms. It is found not only in the charge of battle, but also in the whisper of hope, the refusal to surrender one's soul, and the determination to endure. They may not have been on the front lines, but they too fought, and their fight was every bit as important.
Part 8. Shadows on the Horizon. World War II was not only a clash of armies, tanks, and planes, it was also a shadow war, fought in the darkened corners of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Resistance fighters, intelligence operatives, and ordinary citizens risked everything to tip the balance of power. Their bravery remains one of the least told chapters of history. In Nazi-occupied France, resistance groups disrupted German supply lines, gathered critical intelligence, and prepared the way for the Allied liberation. Armed with little more than courage, makeshift weapons, and sabotage plans, these men and women were hunted relentlessly by the Gestapo. Many paid with their lives, yet their actions tied down German forces and saved countless Allied soldiers. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, partisans under Josip Broz Tito waged a relentless guerrilla war against Axis forces. They became a constant thorn in the side of German commanders, forcing them to divert divisions that might have otherwise fought in Russia or Italy. What started as small bands of fighters grew into one of the most effective resistance movements of the war. Meanwhile, in the east, Chinese guerrilla fighters resisted Japanese occupation, enduring famine, bombardment, and brutal reprisals. Despite overwhelming odds, they kept alive the hope of freedom, their actions making Japan's advance more costly and less sustainable. Then there were the codebreakers and intelligence officers, the silent watchers who turned secrets into survival. The work at Bletchley Park, where Alan Turing and his team cracked the Enigma code, saved millions of lives. Yet their victory remained classified for decades, leaving many of them to pass away without recognition. Their war was waged in secrecy, but its results echoed loudly on the battlefield. Women again played a crucial role here. The SOE sent female agents behind enemy lines, where they worked as couriers, saboteurs, and intelligence gatherers. Figures like Violet Sabo and Nancy Wake became legends in silence, their courage carried on in whispers rather than headlines. And then there were those whose names will never be known, the villagers who sheltered Allied pilots shot down over Europe, the shopkeepers who passed along coded messages, the railway workers who risked execution to delay enemy trains. Their sacrifices rarely entered history books, yet their fingerprints are all over the victories we remember. The war was fought not just in the open, but also in the shadows, by those who chose defiance when silence would have been safer. These were the invisible heroes, the ones who struck blows the world could not see, but whose effects shaped the war's end. As the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the world celebrated victory. Nations rebuilt, flags waved, and medals were handed out. But for countless unsung heroes, the end of the war did not bring parades or recognition. Instead, it brought silence. Many resistance fighters were swallowed back into obscurity, their bravery remembered only in small villages or whispered stories passed down through families. Others faced suspicion or persecution in the political reshuffling of the post-war world. In Eastern Europe, partisans who had fought against the Nazis often found themselves targeted by new regimes that saw them as threats rather than patriots. The colonial troops who had shed blood for empires returned home with expectations of equality and respect. Instead, they often found themselves once again marginalized. In India, Africa, and the Caribbean, many veterans became catalysts for independence movements, channeling their wartime sacrifices into demands for freedom from the very powers they had defended. Women, too, were quietly pushed aside. Having filled factories, offices, and battlefront roles during the war, they were expected to return to domestic life once peace was declared. The daring female spies, resistance members, and factory workers who had helped secure victory rarely saw their contributions properly honored. Their courage was vital, yet history too often wrote them into the margins. Even those who had served within the recognized armies sometimes paid the price of silence. Units like the Tuskegee Airmen, the Nisei 442nd, and the Polish pilots of the RAF faced discrimination despite their unmatched records. Their heroism was undeniable, but prejudice denied them the honor they deserved at the time. And then there were the millions who never returned, the nameless soldiers, civilians, and prisoners of war, whose sacrifices were absorbed into statistics. Their families carried the weight of memory, but the world moved on, eager to celebrate victory rather than dwell on loss. The tragedy of these forgotten heroes is not only that they went unrecognized, but that the lessons they embodied, courage, sacrifice, unity across borders, risk being lost with them. Their stories are not just fragments of the past, they are warnings and reminders for the future. History remembers the battles, the generals, the treaties, but true history also lives in the hearts of those who carried burdens without glory. These were the men and women who gave everything, only to vanish into silence when the war was won. Why we must remember. The story of World War II is often told in terms of victories, defeats, and the names of great leaders. But behind every headline, every battle map, and every celebrated general, there were countless men and women whose contributions remain hidden in the shadows. These forgotten heroes remind us that history is not only shaped by the powerful, but also by the ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Their sacrifices carry lessons that echo through time. They show us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. They teach us that freedom is not won by a few, but safeguarded by many. Soldiers, workers, nurses, code breakers, farmers, and civilians who chose resistance over surrender. To forget them is to risk diminishing the true cost of the war. It is to reduce history to dates and generals, while ignoring the very people whose sacrifices made those victories possible. Remembering them restores balance to the story. It honors those who carried burdens without ever seeking glory. Today, as we face new uncertainties and global challenges, their stories hold meaning for us still. They remind us of the resilience of the human spirit, of the power of unity across borders, and of the quiet strength found in ordinary lives. Their legacy is not confined to the past. It belongs to the present and the future. In remembering these forgotten heroes, we do more than pay tribute. We give voice to the voiceless, ensuring that their courage is never lost to silence again. Their memory is a beacon, reminding us that even in the darkest times, humanity's light can shine through. This is why their stories must continue to be told, not just as history, but as a living testament to the sacrifices of those who gave everything and asked for nothing. They were the unsung forces of World War II, and now, at last, their voices are heard.